So I thought I'd start by just pointing out we may be here for a while. I prepared all of my notes, and then this afternoon thinking, I think they usually give me about an hour. I should probably see if I can fit all of this into an hour. I asked Google, how long does it normally take to read 14,000 words? And to my great pleasure, Google told me 46.7 minutes. So I thought, this is great. It also said 300 words per minute. And I was like, okay, I think I can do that. So then I looked online and I asked Google the question, how many words per minute do people normally speak? And they told me the average person speaks 150 words per minute. So I'm going to have to speak twice as fast as your average Joe to get through all of that I have to say tonight. And I've already lost time. All right. One of the questions that I asked myself as I was preparing the lecture for tonight was, why in the world would I come back to a subject which has already been very well covered by one of the greatest scholars of the 19th century, John Henry Newman? And I think one of the reasons why is that for a large part of our society, we've forgotten the lessons that he taught us. In his idea of the university, published in the mid-1800s, John Henry Newman was concerned to show that the university must not exclude theology from the sciences taught within her walls, number one. And number two, that the university should primarily teach the liberal arts rather than overemphasizing or even, in fact, promoting practical sciences and arts. It's not to say those things couldn't be there or couldn't be in the university, but they shouldn't be the primary subject taught in the universities. He was already interacting in the 1850s to 70s with people who pretended that theology was a thing of personal fancy. It really didn't have a place within the university. By 1987, the situation in American universities had gotten so bad that Alan Bloom, in his well-known book, The Closing of the American Mind, would begin with the following statement. There is one thing a professor can be absolutely certain of. Almost every student entering the university believes or says he believes that truth is relative. He later notes that the universities now offer no distinctive visage to the young person. He finds a democracy of the disciplines. This democracy is really an anarchy because there are no recognized rules for citizenship and no legitimate titles to rule. In short, there is no vision, nor is there a set of competing visions of what an educated human being is. This was written in 1987 about the state of the American university. Moving forward a touch further, in 2008, Ryan Topping wrote an article published in New Black Friars. He suggests that Newman's idea of a university is long dead. He says that today we do better to speak of the multiversity if we are to consider the theoretical basis of the university at all. The multiversity is inconsistent. She has no single goddess as her patron. Rather, she is ruled by a pantheon of conflicting powers and interests. It's not just that the university is now disunified. Many universities have become entrenched in what today is known as the decolonization of their studies, of the curriculum. A good friend of mine, Owen Anderson, is entrenched in warfare right now in his own university where he holds tenure as the philosophy department seeks to decolonize the philosophy department. He wrote to me and pointed out that they are now requiring DEI training to inform their employees of the problem of whiteness and heteronormativity. In a 2001 presentation, which was published in a book on Newman's idea of the university, Alan Charles Kors notes that most secular universities today, in the 2000s, promise academic freedom but deliver selective academic oppression. He goes on to explain how universities such as Carnegie Mellon, Cornell, Tufts, Pennsylvania State University, and many others have censored Christian public debate on questions related to abortion and sexuality, even firing faculty members who would not submit to questionable actions forced upon them by the administration. He notes, for example, this is a quote, how at Cornell, residential advisor Timothy George, a Catholic, asked on ground of religious conscience to be excused from viewing films of homosexual intercourse, which were supposed to desensitize him to homophobia. He was fired. Stories abound of faculties, members, and students being forced into submission or fired for not adhering to questionable practices or ideas. One wonders, is this the so-called freedom of the university? Should the university, its faculty and students, be servant of contemporary trends, new ideas, party politics, and the dogmatic pronouncements of prominent scholars or socio-political leaders? Seems dire. I'm going to go back to 1938 now. In 1938, a new faculty was established at Université Laval. This is where I obtained my PhD. The Faculté des Lettres, Faculty of Letters. It would teach literature from all times and places, a variety of languages, anthropology, archaeology, history, geography, and many other subjects. In the same year, a young scholar, Maurice Lebel, began his career as professor at this newly established faculty. 24 years later, now by this point the dean of that faculty, in 1962, he gave a public lecture titled La tradition du nouveau, the tradition of the new, or of the novel. He suggests with particular clarity that modern man is fascinated with novelty and despises the past. Quote, the 20th century man contents himself with the relationships of smells, colors, and sounds, with the distant and surprising relations between sensible reality, the intellectual life, and the moral realm. He suffers constantly from the all-consuming desire to surprise and astonish. Desiring to create himself and to be noticed, he cultivates the worship of the spicy. For the record, I translated this directly from the French myself, and so some of these terms, I did my best. I did speak French for the past 20 years of my life, so it's as good as I think I can get it. Worship of the spicy. That almost sounds contemporary, honestly. Of that which surprises, such as the effect of treason. We may understand here the worship of novelty. He calls it the cult of novelty, or the worship of novelty, preferred over that of the past or of tradition. That is, modern man loves above all things the novel, the new, the unexpected, the unexplored, that which has not yet been experienced, the unforeseen, change in both life and business. He loves that which has not yet become customary, the experience of something, that which has just now produced, and which is different from that which was made before. Furthermore, he no longer respects tradition, which is the link between the present and the past. Fascinated by the present, he has little interest in historic traditions of the past and of our ancestors. For him, the past is not his master, it is rather the future, which is his master. Today, the cult of novelty, which Lebel decried in the 1960s, that's almost about 60 years ago, that cult has grown stronger. The rejection of the past and of tradition has turned from disdain into destruction. Not only do we hate our fathers, we seek to kill them. Our fascination with the future, absence from the present, and flight from the past is passed on like a generational illness which has become an epidemic. What initially looked like freedom has become chains, which keep modern man from seeing beyond his material, technological, technique-driven future self to the transcendent truth, goodness, and beauty, which calls him through his past and into his present. Modern man does not realize that his future beckons him from the past. Lebel describes the crippling danger of novelty in the following words. Quote, it presents a gigantic, compelling, fascinating image, always changing. It gives the impression of indefinite, linear, straight progress. It exerts a blinding fascination upon the spirit. Fascination is a word I'm going to come back to later in relation to the scholar. It's almost like being captivated. A blinding fascination upon the spirit to the point that the spirit, falling into provincialism and vain complacency, ceases to recognize itself and to see itself as it actually is. Knowledge of self and what we will do with our life, which we arrive at through meditation, solitude, and suffering, is difficult, even impossible, without comparing oneself with things and people who are different from ourselves and indeed who are better than us. Continual novelty imprisons man in an immense cage of image-deforming mirrors. It makes man into a king, but a king who is living in a palace of illusions. This formidable idolatry of the new man towards himself, unceasing and massive worship of the new for the sake of its novelty, permanent and always changing revolutions. This is the tragedy of our time. The new, I'm not quoting him anymore. The new is not per se problematic, but the love of novelty, of constant renewal and perpetual change does lead us into a situation where we are unable to understand ourselves. We no longer know who we are, not just as individuals, but as human beings. We do not understand our world, nor the God who created it all. It becomes a prison with chains like those that Boethius describes in his Consolation of Philosophy. When Lady Philosophy finds Boethius bemoaning his sorrows in such a state that it's almost as if the chains have bound him and pointed his eyes towards the earth rather than towards the heavens where the philosopher should be looking. What then can we do? How can we be freed from this cult of novelty? Well, for Lebel, one role of the university is to free us from these man-made constraints, to help us to resist the prison of novelty, to lead us to a better knowledge of self, world, and God. Lebel goes on to note things that don't change. He points towards human nature. Human nature does not change. We can add to that the questions that humans ask. He says, on top of that, the problems of thought, of action, and of organization are eternal. They are constantly rethought or restarted. Other unchanging things would be human ideals, the desire for the transcendent, or God. Man's wonder and amazement before the unknown, which directs man to pursue truth and obtain knowledge, is also perennial. These things are unchanging. For Lebel, part of the solution to the chains of a mundane and ephemeral fascination with the never-ending allure of the novel is to be introduced to the eternal through the study of the humanities. We might say it differently. The primary goal of the university is to free man from the chains of the earthly and the worldly by being brought into the presence of the eternal. His lecture just provides us with the entryway into our question today. What is the nature of the university? What I want to do, I'm going to go quickly through the first one, a little bit less quick through the second one, and then I'm going to take some time in my third point. Point number one that I want to look at is, rapidly, the historical origins of the modern university. There is a sense in which if you want to understand what something is, you need to go back to its beginnings. In fact, that's one of the meanings of the word physis in Greek, is that from which something comes. So we can go back to that. Second thing I want to look at is the nature of the acquisition of knowledge. And for that, we will go to Aristotle. And Aristotle is going to teach us some things about the nature of the acquisition of knowledge, which will be absolutely fundamental for helping us understand the nature of the university. And then once we've understood those 2 points, we're going to dive into a number of different characteristics of the university. And then I will conclude with some brief comments about what that might entail for contemporary universities, or the university today. So let's start with the history. And as I said, I'm going to keep this as brief as possible. Joseph Pieper, in 1950, shortly after World War II, published 2 articles. They started off as 2 lectures. They were in the little book called What Does Academic Mean? What does academic mean? And he begins this article by noting that the word academy can be traced back to the name given to the school of the celebrated Greek philosopher Plato. It received this name because of its proximity to the grove of an Athenian city hero, Academos. Now you could ask the question, and he does, what does that have to do with the academy? It almost seems as if it got the name by accident and not by its relation to the thing. Well, however, whatever the reason for that particular word, the word academy, associated with Plato's school, has come to represent scholarity today, the academic world. It continued its existence, though perhaps waning in popularity, in fact being destroyed at one point in its history, but it continued its existence up until about the 6th century after Christ. Its students flourish today. We call them Platonists, just in case anyone was wondering. They don't study at the academy anymore, as far as I know. If they do, I need to maybe make a visit to Europe. The Platonic Academy can be seen as the ancient model of what would become the medieval university. The medieval university, it would be the model. In fact, some medieval universities still exist today. They were founded in the medieval time period and continue to exist. So many of the most important contemporary European universities were founded and began their operations in the Middle Ages. The development of these universities out of cathedral schools was very organic, often quite different. As the universities developed, they had different specialties that they also began pushing. So for example, some of these universities specialized in law, some in medicine, and some in theology. And I don't have time to get into all of those distinctions, which ones were who and what and everything. So I'm going to take maybe one example, and I want to talk about some aspects of medieval university education. So first of all, we can talk about the example of the University of Paris, which emerged organically from the cathedral school at the Cathedral of Notre Dame. It arrived somewhere around the years of 1120 and 1160. By the year 1200, a charter was signed creating a guild of professors in Paris, a guild being somewhat similar to what today we would call a faculty. Great scholars associated with the University of Paris at one time or another include Albert the Great, Thomas Aquinas, and John Calvin, and many others. Other universities gaining recognition by the year 1200 include Oxford and Bologna. In the 13th century, a number of other universities were opened as well in Padua, Naples, Montpellier, Toulouse, Salamanca, and Cambridge. Stephen Morone, in an article on the rise of universities in Europe, he notes that to be counted as a university, what could be called a studium generale, an educational establishment, quote, had to contain more than one faculty of study attracting students from far and wide and possessing adequate standing to guarantee its graduates the privilege of teaching at any other school. For Protestants, it's worth noting, almost every single Protestant reformer was trained in one of the medieval universities. Some of them became professors in universities that were originally founded in the medieval time period. What about the curriculum and the way they taught? Well, quickly, the core curriculum in the universities, or you might say the most basic elements of study, would have been what we call today a faculty of arts, or the liberal arts. They studied, and I say this in the presence of some who know this perhaps even better than myself, they studied the subjects known as the trivium and the quadrivium. That is, they studied grammar, logic, and rhetoric, the natural sciences, mathematics, and music. Typically, we talk about, let me see here, 7 liberal arts. However, if you read Hugh of St. Victor, he has 8. One of the things that's interesting is that sometimes in these medieval universities, they had more or less subjects included in their base courses, or their basic courses. Teaching methods included, according to Morone, lectures on foundational texts, supplemented by classroom and sometimes public disputation on theoretical problems or issues of interpretation and elaboration. In all cases, Morone goes on to note, students began by attending lectures for a few years, then added the obligation to take part in the public disputations, and finally moved to determination. When as bachelors of arts, they would begin themselves lectures on base texts in submagisterial, magisterial, or cursory classes. In other words, near the end of their bachelor program, they began teaching. They would then teach for a period of time, and they would be awarded a Master of Arts. The philosophical basis for these methods of teaching, I'll point out to 2 of them and then move on really quickly. Number one of these principles that underlines the idea of lecturing within the classroom is that you can only give what you possess. This is the basic principle of causality applied to teaching. You can only give what you actually possess. You must first acquire knowledge before you can be expected to engage in disputations in a knowledgeable manner on the subject in question. If you don't already know it, you can't talk about it. Another related principle, Brian Davies, in an article called Aquinas and Catholic Universities, he notes that no teacher can cause or produce knowledge in their students. All of the professors perhaps are like, wait a second, I thought we were doing that. Davies rightly notes that we do not cause or produce knowledge in our students. The Augustinian notion of Christ as our teacher through divine illumination, which would later be adopted by Thomas Aquinas, leads to the conclusion, suggests Davies, that, quote, nobody can cause you to know. They can cause you to have certain sense data, and they can brainwash you so that you end up expressing assent to various propositions. But they cannot make you know. And yet, so Aquinas thinks, they can help you to know. As such, the professor may help students learn the means by which they may be enabled to acquire knowledge. And Davies points out 3 things. Number 1, training them to speak and use the convention of language to communicate and understand communication. So grammar, rhetoric, logic, those ideas. To reason well and to recognize good and bad arguments. And number 3, by training them how to research and by presenting them with trustworthy truths worthy of belief, and then by helping them to see those truths for themselves. The student shouldn't just believe what the professor says. The student should be brought to see the truths. This means that the Socratic method had to be adapted in order to account for the realities of human knowledge and the human nature and knowledge acquisition. We talk about the Socratic method. For Socrates, the reason why the Socratic method works is because everybody has within themselves implanted ideas. And so by questioning, the teacher was able to cause the individual to move within themselves, find those ideas, and bring them out. The knowledge is already possessed. You're not learning. You are, in fact, remembering. But if you don't have those ideas within you, then how do you get them? You must see them. And so the Socratic method had to be changed in the medieval time period. Learning was, rather than being a remembering, it was being shown the truths in question. The role of the professor was to understand and then preserve and transmit through lectures and treatises the knowledge they had acquired in their studies. So that's the history of it. Let's talk about knowledge acquisition. For this, we move to Aristotle. Aristotle's metaphysics begins with the well-known declaration, all men by nature desire to know. Now that single line from the metaphysics could be taken to encapsulate the entire academic endeavor. It could be a very good summary of what we mean by philosophy. All men by nature desire to know. I could probably teach a couple of lectures just talking about what that single line presupposes as far as human nature, on the nature of knowledge, and the nature of the things that are known, desire in relationship to knowledge, and so on and so forth. But I'll save you. We don't have forever. And I want to get home tonight, so we'll move forward. Having given that line, Aristotle then goes on to ask the question, what do we mean by knowledge? What is this wisdom that we are pursuing? In order to help us understand what we mean by wisdom, he goes to an odd place. He goes to the arts. And so in the metaphysics, rather than go to the scientist, he goes to the arts. And he asks, what is it about the artisan that lets us say this person is an artist and possesses art? Art for Aristotle is not a work of art. There's not many works of art in here that I can point to. So this is about the most artistic thing in the room I think I can point to, perhaps aside from my bow tie. And so art is not something like a work of art. It's not a painting. It's not a statue. Art is a habit that you possess by which you are able to apply universals to a particular matter, and specifically the creation or production of something that is beautiful. The artisan has the ability and then uses that ability to produce a work of art. I'm going to summarize this section on the artist for the sake of time. When we look at the artist and we ask what makes this person an artist, one of the things that we realize is that they have knowledge of the universal. But it's not simply knowledge of the universal. Someone could have theory and not be a good artist. It's also the ability to habitually take that knowledge, habitually meaning almost by second nature. You're not thinking about it. When you think about by second nature, it's a type of thing that you learn when you're juggling. I don't have my juggling balls with me. Oh, I do. They're actually over there. But I can't go that far to get them. So it's this idea that you have formed a habit such that you no longer think about it. It just happens. If someone threw a juggling ball at me and I just catch it without thinking about it, that's that habit that's created. We talk about the same thing when we talk about virtue. The virtuous man doesn't think about what is right and wrong and what they should or should not do. They do the right thing. That's why sometimes we say it's almost as if it's by nature. It could be described as by second nature. So we have a habitual state. And this is what we mean by knowledge. And so if we dive a little bit deeper into knowledge, what we mean by knowledge is not that you happen to have facts. You have a habitual state of knowing. Knowing but in connection with universals, and specifically, the principles and causes of the thing that is known. This is going to allow Aristotle to distinguish between practical arts and sciences and the theoretical or the speculative. And he's going to suggest that when we do a practical science, the practical science is always in service of something else. Why do you learn how to paint? So that you can create something. You learn how to work on a car so that you can fix your car. Or at least in our current economy, so that you can save money. In both cases, there's a so that. With theoretical or speculative knowledge, you are seeking knowledge not for something else, but for itself. In this case, knowledge is an end in itself. It's not for something. The wise man, we think, only knows principles. The wise man not only knows the principles and causes of the object of his study, for Aristotle, he also knows how to teach others as well. So he understands the principles and causes, and he knows how to teach them. Aristotle will move on to provide 4 basic characteristics which can be predicated of any wise man. These are the 4 things. Number 1, they know all things as far as possible. They have universal knowledge. I mean, at least as much as is possible for a human being. Number 2, he who can learn things which are difficult and not easy for men to know. Now, by this, he's referring to the universals. Not universal knowledge, but knowledge of universals. The forms, the causes, the principles of all things are difficult to know. Number 3, he is more exact and more capable. He is more exact and is more capable of teaching others. He has precision. He has precision because of the knowledge that he has of the causes and principles. And then finally, the wise man is not ordered, but orders. He puts in order. He is not put in order. These things actually bring us to a second point by Aristotle, knowledge, and specifically the knowledge that we're looking for here. That is wisdom or knowledge of the ultimate causes. This knowledge is also, therefore, most free. You can put it this way, it's the most liberal and most liberating. Aristotle says, as the man is free, we say, who exists for his own sake and not for another's, so we pursue this, that is wisdom or knowledge. He will later call it the divine science or first philosophy. We pursue this as the only free science, for it alone exists for its own sake. That's where we get the term liberal arts from. We do not talk about liberal arts in relationship to somehow freeing man, but that these arts are of themselves free. They are not subservient to anything else. Pieper, Joseph Pieper, who I mentioned earlier, registers his agreement with this point, noting that insomuch as it is not directed to some practical or useful aspect, the highest form of wisdom, which is properly philosophical, is also, he says, quote, by its very nature free. It is of itself a meaningful activity, with no relevance to goals outside of itself. It cannot be taken into service. We don't seek this knowledge for something other than itself. And I should note, if what Aristotle says at the beginning of the metaphysics is true, that all men by nature desire to know, that in pursuing this knowledge, you are also fulfilling your very nature and flourishing as a human being. Third point, some consequences of the difficulty of knowing. Aristotle doesn't stop with talking about those things. The next time he talks about the nature of this knowledge, he also points out it's one of the most difficult things to obtain. In fact, it's worth noting that as far as Aristotle is concerned, we don't really have a whole lot of this knowledge. Many people in their lives may not ever gain a lot of knowledge. C.S. Lewis notes in Mere Christianity, 95% of the things you think you know, you only believe. In fact, we function with most of our lives on belief. It is very difficult to obtain. Aristotle notes that this difficulty is caused either by the subject of knowledge or by the object of knowledge. Subject being us, the humans, object, the things we're seeking to know. In relationship to the divine, Aristotle says this is so far beyond human abilities of knowledge. He says this is the image that he gives us. As the eyes of the bats are to the blaze of day, so is the reason in our soul to the things which are by nature more evident of all, that is, the divine. This is, in fact, one of the reasons why that Aquinas suggests in Summa Theologia Prima Par, question 1, article 1, we need divine help. Natural thinking, natural reason by itself is not able to attain to salvific knowledge of God. In light of this, Aristotle suggests that as humans are directed towards knowledge by nature and equipped to acquire knowledge, it seems that we should be able to learn from just about anyone. Humans by nature seek to know. Everybody must have something that they in fact know, and so we should be open to learning from every person we run into. Solomon says in Proverbs 11:14, in an abundance of counselors there is safety, and in 24 verse 6 he says, in an abundance of counselors there is victory. We should seek an abundance of counselors, seek to learn from as many as we can. In fact, Aristotle will suggest we should be thankful for those who precede us. Even those with whom we disagree, in fact. For as wrong as they may be, in our humble opinions, they may have indeed stumbled upon some truths. In fact, they may help us to better articulate and defend the truths that we in fact know, simply by interaction with them. Brian Davies points to this sentiment when he says of Aquinas that he clearly thought that people who disagreed with him could help him to learn. As such, we should show grace and intellectual generosity to those with whom we disagree, recognizing, first of all, that if we stand in the truth, it is not by our own intellectual prowess. 2, if they stand in error, well, this is the common state of human nature, and except by God's grace, we stand there too. And also, their error allows us to better understand the truths we do know. And then thirdly, we now or in the future may be the opponents to be refuted, upon whose shoulders the future generation will gain better knowledge of truth. Forgetting these realities is what has turned our current universities into echo chambers and warring tribes. We have forgotten that we can learn from each other. With these reflections on knowledge, let's talk about the characteristics of the university. There are 6 characteristics of a true university. I'll give them all to you now and then fly through them in the time that remains. Well, I'm doing pretty good. I might have time for all of this. We'll see. So the 6 are the following. 1, a true university education is philosophical. 2, it is theological. 3, it is liberal. 4, it is universal. 5, perennial. And then 6, dialectical. Let's work through each of these together. First of all, Joseph Pieper, in his article, What Does Academic Mean?, argues that the academic is by nature philosophical. The academy by nature is philosophical. He says this: one indisputable fact is that Plato's school in Athens was a philosophical school, a community of people philosophizing, so that its intrinsic characteristic is philosophy, the philosophical way of looking at the world. From this, a first defining element of the academic, results the thesis. Academic means philosophical. An academic educational institution is a philosophical one which is at least based on philosophy. To pursue a branch of knowledge in an academic way means to pursue it philosophically. A subject of study that has no philosophical orientation is not academic. And all of you are thinking, well, of course he says that. His graduate degrees are in philosophy. It's kind of self-serving. But let's understand what we mean by philosophical. Pieper also, in his work, says, but what do we mean by this? And then he moves on, he says, well, what we mean by philosophical is theoretical. And you're like, well, great, that got us like a small, tiny step forward. What do we mean by theoretical? Well, theoretical, he suggests, amounts to, quote, it is an attitude towards the world which is only concerned with the fact that things reveal themselves as they are, which is what truth actually consists of. To be aiming at truth and nothing else is the essence of theoria. Perhaps another way to put this is, to be philosophical is to be seeking the truth. It's to have an attitude of, I want to know the truth about this. It has nothing to do with, how can I use this? It's wanting to know it as it is. This is the primary aim of any domain of study, which merits the title science. This is indeed the primary aim of the university, to train the mind to know the truth. Though wisdom may be turned towards practical ends, such as doing or making, wisdom is, in its highest and purest sense, theoretical or speculative, not practical or utilitarian. Now, one may find courses taught in the universities which are practical in nature, that is, aimed at the achieving of targets, as Pieper says, or as action or at production. Pieper suggests, Newman seems to go in a similar direction, that this is not, however, the primary aim of the university. And it should not be the primary aim of the university. The purpose of the university is to provide a milieu where scholars study, discover, teach, preserve, and proliferate knowledge about all that they can know for the sake of helping students as they seek to know the truth. Practice, in fact, depends upon theory. The practical is grounded in the speculative. Now, lest our point be misunderstood, let's also quote Pieper on this point. This formulation, he says, is of course a conscious exaggeration which is open to misunderstanding. But I believe that it expresses what is central to the meaning of philosophical and academic. It does so with much greater precision than all the attempts to base the inner justification of academic education on its importance for life, or on its importance for technological, economic, or military praxis, or for any other kind of praxis. Newman illustrates this point well when he says, and I quote, "If, for instance, theology, instead of being cultivated as a contemplation, be limited to the purposes of the pulpit, or be represented by the catechism, it loses not its usefulness, not its divine character, not its meritoriousness. Rather, it gains a claim upon these titles by such charitable condescension. But it does lose the particular attribute which I am illustrating, for theology thus exercised is not simple knowledge, but rather is an art or a business-making use of theology. It is a taking of theology as a science, a desire to know, and a turning towards practical uses. How can it be used? When we hear these statements, and then we look at the contemporary university today, we realize that contemporary universities are glorifying utilitarian and practical ends over speculative and the natural ends of the type of education they should be providing. As can even be seen by perusing the purpose statements of any number of contemporary institutes of higher education today, or articles written in defense of the liberal arts. Many seek to defend universities or college studies by suggesting that they are good for some practical use, such as remembering our histories or technological advancement. Perhaps some personal purpose, such as making the student into a better person or a better citizen. I'll come back to that point. It is indeed hard to sell the importance of supporting a college or a university when supporters hear it's good for nothing. It's useless. It's not good for any, I would say, though, it is good for nothing more than helping students flourish as human beings by helping them to know the truth. It would seem, to the great dismay of marketing teams around the world, that the actual value of the university or college is fundamentally at odds with its own financial stability and viability. That's the philosophical. Now, lest my esteemed theological colleagues begin getting worried by my embrace of the philosophical, let's turn to the second attribute, which is the theological. John Henry Newman, in his The Idea of a University, argues in the first main section that the university is ultimately directed towards theological ends, though its means may be philosophical, speculative, theoretical. Its ends are theological. They are God-directed. In his renowned lectures delivered to the Catholics in Dublin in 1852, he argues, among other things, that the study of theology is not just a necessary part of university education, but it is that towards which the entire academic endeavor leads. Theology is indeed the queen of the sciences. Not just their glory, but she governs them and orders all the other sciences, and she is served by all the other sciences. The first thing he does in his idea of a university is to quickly note what he means when he talks about theology as the end of the education. And he quickly points out that for the sake of making his argument sound, though he does believe that theology based upon special revelation should be and must be necessarily included within a university education, he's only going to argue for natural theology, that which can naturally be known about God. He does later say, however, that the study of theology, which does not include the study of special revelation, is lacking one of its primary sources. His argument works more or less along the following lines. If a university is to be a place in which every form of knowledge is studied, and if theology is a form of knowledge, then no institute of higher education that excludes the study of theology may be rightly called a university. Here's an exact quote. If a university be, from the nature of the case, a place of instruction where universal knowledge is professed, and if in a certain university, so called, the subject of religion is excluded, one of the two conclusions is inevitable. Either on the one hand, that the province of religion is very barren of real knowledge, or on the other, that in such a university, one special and important branch of knowledge is omitted. Now, that latter would be a grievous recognition to make for any university. They call themselves a university where universal knowledge is taught, but they have left aside not just one branch of knowledge, but the most important. Newman goes on to argue. He doesn't spend perhaps as much time on it as he could, though he may not have needed to either, and I suspect I don't need to either in light of those who are in this room. He goes on to argue that theology is indeed a science. We know a great deal about God, suggests Newman. I'm not going to read the whole quote here, I'll just read a selection of it. He says, God is an individual, self-dependent, all-perfect, unchangeable being, intelligent, living, personal, and present, almighty, all-seeing, all-remembering, between whom and his creatures there is an infinite gulf. A little bit later on, he says, one in whose hands are all things, who has a purpose in every event and a standard for every deed, and thus has relations of his own towards the subject matter of each particular science which the book of knowledge unfolds. And then later, who thereby necessarily becomes the subject matter of a science far wider and more noble than any of those which are included in the circle of secular education. Now, whether or not we agree with some of his specific ways of articulating the divine nature, he very clearly is pointing out we do know something about God. And if we know something about God, then it is a science, and therefore must be included in a university education. I suspect I don't need to argue this point much more with this particular audience, so we'll move on to the next. Liberal and liberating. A university education is liberal and liberating. Now, I had a really cool section about Judith Butler. Everyone's like, how could he fit that in there? Well, guess what? You'll never know, because I'm skipping it. And I'm going straight to Pieper. Pieper, when he delves into the characteristic of studying a subject in a philosophical manner, notes the difference between looking at it philosophically or not philosophically. He says this: the special way of looking into the depth of things so that they are no longer seen as these so-and-so definable things and their usefulness for this or that purpose, but as forms of the most amazing, imaginable reality, namely as forms of being, that's the start. And it awakens in us wonder. And then he says this: in this moment of wonder, a discovery of being, there's a forgetting. Here's what he says, quote, "It is the forgetting above all of direct goals in life. All of this is therefore what distinguishes the inner structure, the attitude, the atmosphere that obtains in the study of a specific discipline carried out in a philosophical way. The decisive element is the freedom of being bound to any kind of utilitarian goals." That's the characteristic of true wisdom. You're no longer bound to utility. All usefulness, all other purposes, all hopes for productivity, all other goals, all the ways that this discovery could be put to use in some human society, religion, or civilization, this all falls away in the forgetting that happens in the wonder when we are confronted with being. Think of the philosopher. This has happened to me on a couple times. My kids could attest to this. Who's lost in his thoughts? In my case, one of those moments was studying Aquinas on simplicity and pure act. And the philosopher is engaged in thought, trying to understand this deep question. And as he's thinking about it, he has this eureka moment. When I was studying pure act, I had moments of worship. As they're studying these things, they are overwhelmed with excitement because they are starting to understand truth. As they're overwhelmed with excitement, remember how I said earlier that modern man is fascinated with the new? The scholar is fascinated. He is captivated. Everything else falls away. Children are running around the table screaming, knocking things on the floor, and the philosopher is amazed by some reality which has captivated him. Usefulness is unimportant. This captivation is true freedom. In fact, the scholar might not even realize that what he has discovered is useful for anything. Maybe it is. He doesn't care. He's just amazed with the truth. If you've never experienced this, go get lost in the forest sometime. Go camping and get up early enough to see the sunrise and take time to watch it rise. As Pieper notes, individual disciplines can indeed be used to serve utilitarian ends. However, as soon as we seek to harness the university into the service of some other purpose, such as an ideology, a slogan, or a party, we destroy it. He says, philosophical theoria is destroyed by being pressed into service. One can think one is using philosophy, but insofar as one does, it is no longer philosophy. Philosophy is free, or it is not philosophy. Individual disciplines, on the other hand, can only be free to the extent that they are carried out in an academic way, that is, with philosophical theoria. When the university and academic studies are pressed into the service of some ulterior purpose, they are destroyed. This is, of course, the perennial temptation of the man of action, to make that which is, by its very nature, free, subservient to his own ends. I have a great quote from Newman here, which I'm skipping, and a nice comment from Avery Cardinal Dulles, also skipping. There's a lot there. It's a lot of fun. As with the quoting of a passage of Scripture out of context, or the domination and directing of nature towards ends which are not its own, such as a stallion being directed to the ends of war, so, to make the university subservient to any purpose other than the fostering of a milieu for the philosophical or theoretical pursuit of knowledge for its own sake is to turn a university into a tool destined to serve those who govern it. When this happens, it is denatured and made into something unnatural. That's not to say we shouldn't have schools to train people to do practical things. We do. They're called trade schools. Trade schools exist to teach people how to do trades. Seminaries exist to train pastors, missionaries, evangelists. Teaching schools train teachers. The end of the university, of the liberal arts, is to train humans. Is to train man to flourish in his God-given desire for knowledge. Next, universal. We're going to move quickly here. The university is universal. It can be universal in two senses. It's universal first in the sense that it studies every single thing that man can know. It should all be there. The true scholar, though they may specialize or have greater knowledge in some one area of knowledge, should be able to take that knowledge and apply it to any other area. They should also be interested as much as is possible by every single thing that which comes before them. And for those of you who have advanced far in your studies, you will realize that that actually starts happening, where you start studying something, and then something else piques your curiosity, and then you're off on a tangent. Now, that's technically a vice of the intellectual life. For those of you who know what I'm talking about, if you don't, you can ask me about that later. Boethius, in his De Trinitate, says that it is a scholar's duty to try to formulate his opinion about each thing as it actually is. So in that sense, universities are universal. In the second sense, universities are universal because of their theological end. God is the universal cause, and God has within him the ideas, or the forms, we could say, which are the universal causes of all that is. Newman suggests that as to the range of university teaching, that was in that first paragraph. Actually, on this point, I wanted to point to someone in the room. One of our students who graduated last year, Seth Graham, wrote his master's thesis called The Seven Liberal Arts on their reduction to theology, in which he suggested that it is not just the liberal arts as a whole which point to God, but that each of the liberal arts individually also point to God. God is the universal end of a liberal arts education. Next, it is also ancient yet always new. It's perennial. In the Consolation of Philosophy, Boethius describes Lady Philosophy as having a complexion that was fresh with an ever lively bloom, but appearing to be so ancient that none would think her of our time. She transcends time, from the past to the present. I started off with this, with quotes from Maurice Lebel, who points out that we are fascinated with the new, and yet a liberal arts education takes us back to the ancient, but always new. We are to ask questions such as, what is good? What is man? Where do all things come from? If there's evil, how can there be a good God? But if there is goodness, how could there not be a God? Or, as Aristotle says of the perennial question, what is being? These are the questions that we need to not only answer, we need to learn how to ask. Finally, it's dialectical. The medieval scholars understood this well. To be dialectical means that you interact critically with the thoughts of those who precede us or who live in our own time. This does not mean that we necessarily refute or reject them. To interact critically may mean we agree with them. It at very least means that we consider an opinion as if it was true in order to better understand it. There's a lot I could say about this. The very purpose of the medieval disputatio, on principle, excluded no argument and no partner, and thereby automatically enforces a universality of aspects. We see this best in my opinion, disputed questions of Thomas Aquinas, especially when you get into things like the De Veritate, where he asks a single question and then sometimes gives 20-something opinions, after which he gives his own and then he answers all 20 of the other opinions. This is the dialectical process. And what's fun about Thomas Aquinas is when he gives another opinion, he doesn't straw man it. He gives it in the strongest possible form he can think of. There's no point in killing a straw man in a disputation. We tend, in our universities, towards uniformity of belief among our faculties, rather than encouraging public debate and discourse and dialogue. This ultimately negates the very goal of the true university education, in which scholars with different specializations, interests, and ideas should be coming together in joint pursuit of truth, to present and defend their differing ideas on the public stage, in public debate of ideas. Rather than foster public discourse and debate about important truths, the desire for uniformity of belief creates an atmosphere of suspicion and witch hunting. Scholars have to hide their more controversial views, not because they don't think they can be defended publicly, but because they fear the consequences of not adhering to the party line. To stray from the enforced uniformity of belief means to be canceled. Rather than fostering the public exchange of ideas, this allows the prospering of ideologies in the shadows. The public pronouncement of one's belief, putting them out there for all people to either agree with or criticize, is actually a very Christian idea. The very first Christian extra-biblical authors, such as Justin Martyr, Aristides, and some of the early apologists, they wrote to the Caesars with the very firm and stated belief that if we present you with these truths and you consider them rationally, you will come to see them as true and will join us. They had no fear of letting their ideas be put out in public. The consequences of dialectical nature of the university are, first of all, that we have a place where scholars are encouraged without consequence to publicly present their personal opinions, theories, and ideas for serious debate and discourse. What better than to have one's ideas broadcast publicly where you can be corrected? If all men by nature desire truth, then should we not desire correction when we are wrong? And secondly, the scholar who is convinced of the truth of their opinions shouldn't be worried about the public examination of those beliefs through the dialectical process, nor fear reprisal if their opinions go against the beliefs of others in their institutions. So we've talked about the philosophical, theological, liberal, universal, perennial, and dialectical nature of the university. Let me conclude with some reflections on institutional and consequences and some side effects of a true university education. This is going to take about 2 or 3 minutes because I'm going to skim this. First of all, institutional consequences. In light of what a university is, it should be clear that the liberal arts or humanities are the foundation of a true university education. No institute not grounded upon the liberal arts has the right to call itself a university. And we can add to that with John Henry Newman. No university who does not include knowledge, the study of true theology has the right to call itself a university. Secondly, faculty members of a university should be hired based upon their dedication to the purpose and characteristics of the university just discussed. Their dedication to the pursuit of truth wherever it leads them. Of course, their degree of specialization. But also their ability to interact with other areas of the liberal arts. Their ability to teach the wisdom they have acquired. And also, Brian Davies notes, noting the relationship between teaching and morality, that the acquisition of good desires is a necessary prerequisite for good teaching and learning, which means that you will never get good teachers and learners unless you get people, he says, who are personally drawn to what is really excellent in the field of teaching and study. For Brian Davies, that means that we also need to hire good, morally good professors for the faculty. With a commitment to truth. 3, academic freedom. Universities should not, of course, muzzle their faculty by binding them in their research to ideologies, party slogans, or the views of particular philosophers, theologians, or scientists. Pieper rightly notes, philosophical theoria is destroyed by being pressed into service. He later suggests that anyone who refuses to accept truth as a norm is enabling, even provoking and promoting commitment to inappropriate goals to the arbitrarily chosen targets of some type of praxis. All university professors are tied to truth. That should be what binds them and muzzles them, not ideologies, partisanship, party ties, or political ends. That actually, by the way, on a side note, is what the purpose of tenure was supposed to be. The purpose of tenure was supposed to provide the professor with freedom to teach the truth, even when his entire institute turned against him. And though it has been abused in the past, I know of at least one situation in which it is currently keeping a strong Christian theologian and philosopher in his position at a university which has turned against Christianity altogether. That's what tenure was for. Side effects of a university education, quickly. 1, it will produce both discerning students and discerning scholars. Professors who are held to these standards will gain the abilities to discern truth from error. Students who study under such professors will do the same. Number 2, you will teach scholars who will be able to teach others to do the same, as Paul tells Timothy to do in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 2. Number 3, it will produce good people, good citizens, and good leaders in both church and state. This is not the purpose of the university. This is a side effect of the university. And it's not a guarantee. It's kind of like a proverb. In fact, for all of these side effects, none of these are guarantees. C.S. Lewis rightly points out that the road into Jerusalem also leaves Jerusalem. A good education in liberal arts can take you towards God, but it also can lead you away from God. But Philip Melanchthon rightly notes that in his public lecture on the merit of studying theology, that a good liberal arts education does produce good people, good citizens, and good leaders. And he uses that side effect to appeal to local churches and local civil leaders, to asking them to support the university in her pursuit of truth, to promote the well-being and flourishing of universities. Finally, one of the other side effects is the creation of culture. A true liberal arts education will produce future J.R.R. Tolkien's, C.S. Lewis's, Brandon Sanderson's, for those of you who know him. They will produce artists who will create beautiful works of art, write excellent works of philosophy and theology. In light of the good fruit produced by true universities, I think we need to a certain extent, have a call upon individuals, churches, and national leaders for the sake of church and state and society to creatively discover new ways to promote the good of the truly philosophical, theological, liberal, universal, perennial, and dialectical university. And I would suggest it's urgent. Done. Now, I know you're all applauding because I finished in an hour.
Why don't you take a few questions, but part of our ethos here is to be intentionally relational. We've got some dessert for you and give you everybody the opportunity to interact with Professor Haines one-on-one as well. So a few questions and then we'll join you for dessert.
Excellent. So 3 questions. That's what a few means, right? So a couple questions, and then we'll go out and we can keep talking until the sun rises. Yeah.
Thank you so much for that presentation. It was beautiful. I had a few questions about the misuse of knowledge, namely for its own sake. Could you please elaborate that? So why is it disordered, destroyed, or pressed into service? Is it in the sense of manipulation? Is it in ontological sense? Or is it in ideal or our misunderstanding? So what sort of dismemberment occurs when we try to use it or utilize it? If I understood your statements correctly, of course.
Okay, let me think about that, how you asked that question. You're asking how is science in its proper sense twisted or destroyed when it is pressed into useful ends? Is that right? Something along that lines?
Yeah, quote by the person.
Pieper.
Yes.
Sure. Well, one example that could be thought of is, in fact, the atomic bomb.
It's misused more. Right?
So and so this is one of those places where the study of the liberal arts, in theory, is going to come along and say, well, this discovery that you've made, which is a scientific discovery, is beautiful. It's important. We need to think about, yes, it can be applied, but how do we apply it? Right? So the moral philosophy will be studied in the liberal arts, where we're seeking to know the good for man. And so you're going to ask the moral question of this knowledge about how do we talk about that? Atomic power, put it that way. How should it be used or how should it not be used? Okay, so that would be one example of where liberal arts is going to be helpful for taking something that's sought for knowledge's sake but can be used. Let me think about other examples. One of the aspects that he's trying to get at in this particular point is to say something along the following lines. Knowledge per se is of causes and of the universals. It's not something that you seek it's not something that you're going to seek for practical ends, but when it is taken and applied to practical ends, it can be made into an oppressive philosophy. So it can be used as an ideology. So you can think of like a materialism, and then think about how a Marxist materialism, where it becomes an ideology that's going to be used to basically control people. Examples could be found maybe in C.S. Lewis's Abolition of Man.
So you're more speaking about misuse, misconstrual, because what comes to mind is like Plato's Socrates saying that I don't do this for pay, I don't tutor people, but I do it for its own sake, so there's a distinction. Yeah. So, but basically what you're talking about is we can misuse or we can abuse knowledge, but in itself it will not die or it will not be destroyed, it will not ontologically, depreciate by our utilizing it in a proper, good biblical way, right? Like learn these things and live.
Sure, to a certain extent. I think what the point is to distinguish first between practical knowledge and speculative knowledge, where speculative knowledge is for the sake of knowing, practical is for the sake of doing and producing. And so you can take a knowledge which is speculative and then put it to use. So you can take knowledge of how glass is made, or what happens so that something is made into glass, and then you can use that to make windows. That's the distinction between the two. And then I think the idea that we're getting at is that if we just seek knowledge for the sake of production or for doing, we end up destroying knowledge altogether and making it subservient to practical ends, where knowledge itself per se is not supposed to be driven towards practical ends, but simply to know the truth. Maybe a way of putting this in a theological sense would be something like this. The Westminster Catechism begins with what is the end of man, and says, to know and enjoy God forever. Now, I can take knowledge of God, and I can force it into practical ends. I could come in here and say, God told me, and use my knowledge perhaps of God and your religiosity to try and trick you into doing what I want you to do. I can use it to brainwash you. That type of a thing would be what we're talking about here, where knowledge of God is in itself a good and shouldn't be used for anything else. In fact, we kind of do that in a sense, in a really unfortunate way, when we try to use God to get the things we want in life. Maybe think about a health and wellness approach to religion. Does that help a little bit? So taking that knowledge which is in itself good and then using it for wrong means. I don't know if that answers your question fully. Is there another question? Does that help?
Yes, it just,
Okay.
to me, maybe I misunderstand, but when I hear that, like when we try to use this knowledge, right, like philosophy, it's somehow, it's destroyed, it's dismembered, it's loses its, to me, I hear it in ontological sense, whereas what you're referring to is more like we lose sight of it, we actually lose it altogether. The philosophy itself, it remains because it's basically doesn't, it's not affected by us, right? The being is not affected by us. But our possession basically is very illusory at that point when we try to misuse it. Because even the example that you provided, like, thus says the Lord, right? Well, would a person that truly knows God try to manipulate that? Is that truly an example of knowledge of God? It could be a, how do I say it, manipulation towards those who would desire that, but it's not real. It's basically like they have godliness only in like tongue, but they don't know God. Like,
Sure.
perhaps I can just talk to you afterwards.
Perhaps. I'm not sure I'm following your question, but yeah, let's talk about it afterwards. Yeah, absolutely. Any other questions? Yeah.
So I had a question regarding the term wisdom. A lot of the time when I've even heard like a pastor at home preach about it as like the know-how,
Mm-hmm.
know-how. And even as I've read some like Renaissance humanists, it seemed like the term started to switch then. It's not necessarily just a modern university. Do you think it fell out, or?
I'm not sure when historically that shifts. Wisdom can be used for practical knowledge as well as speculative. Though I think that when we talk about practical knowledge, we're going to often talk about prudence as being what we're talking about. So that the ability to take universals and apply it to particular situations in order to know what to do. So many people today refer to that as wisdom, and I think that is one use of the word wisdom that can be used, that we can have. When Aristotle is talking about wisdom in the metaphysics, he's talking specifically about speculative knowledge of God, or of divine things. So God as the cause, and also the forms as causes, or at least in so much as they have a certain relationship to bringing things into being. Does that help with the notion of practical wisdom?
Yeah.
Okay. I think you saw your hand up as well.
Yes. So if we're looking for more authorities to study this subject, would you say you're a big fan of Judith Butler?
So, I do have a bunch of her books on my shelf. I don't know if that counts as being a fan. Maybe I could say this. When I first read her article on the future of the humanities, I wasn't certain what I would find. And interestingly enough, turns out she almost appears to be in agreement with Aristotle. She does suggest that Some people try and defend the liberal arts based upon how they can be used in society, but she seems to say that the proper way to defend the liberal arts is by appealing to an intrinsic value. They are themselves valuable, not for something that we can get from them, but for themselves, which would bring her in line with Aristotle on that point. Full stop. Any other questions? Yeah.
So you said in your point about the philosophical that the end of a university is to come to know the truth. Then when describing the liberating nature of a university, you described having a eureka moment. You almost like worship.
Yeah.
You said it was worship. Would you say then, putting those two pieces together, that one of the side effects, if not maybe the goal of the university, is to enable people to be free to worship?
One of the side effects would definitely be that people freely worship. I don't know that I don't know if I'd say it specifically like that, because then I feel like that could be politicized easily in a church-state relationship question. I do think that if the end of the university is theological, that is directing man towards God as his ultimate cause, that will necessarily drive him to worship. Philosophically speaking, even the philosophers understood if God is, he deserves worship. Right? And prayers. And even the pre-Socratics talk about God should be prayed to and we need to act morally because there is a God. So I think there is a sense in which, yeah, it does drive us to worship. And so in a free society, perhaps, one might say that the university is guaranteeing the freedom of worship. Something like that. I just want to be careful we don't politicize it, because as soon as we politicize it, we're taking that freedom and making it into something that's useful. Rather than, if I can put it that way, just saying, no, that's the way it is. Let's not politicize it. The answer is yes, in so long as it's not politicized. Does that make sense? Yeah.
So, I think one of the biggest issues in the public university, secondary university, and even like public high school education, middle school, even elementary, is like the teaching of the sexual revolution, basically, and like the push for that. What do you think the purpose or the reason or the goal behind that specific push is in the modern university? Do you think it's a political push?
That's a difficult question to answer. The reason behind that in the university, I think that would take another lecture. Part of the reason has to do with the shift within late 20th and then 21st century thought from seeking to know the world to a phenomenological and psychological approach to self. So a way of putting this is maybe something along the lines of Freud, I don't know how would you turn Freud into a verb? Freudinize, or psychologize, perhaps, reality, but then through a Freudian lens, everything is sexual. And therefore, to understand anything, you have to understand the sexual motivations behind it. Maybe that's part of the reason. I think beyond that, because everything is psychologized, there's an aspect of saying that we are our sexual desires. And so there's a pursuit of freedom in this idea. It's almost counterintuitive to say it this way, but they're pursuing the liberal aspect of the university by pursuing sexual liberty, the freedom of sexual desires. And is that which makes you what you are? And so it's the desire to understand you as a human being. I can't say much more without going into a lot more details on Freud, Lacan, the 20th century reaction to the two of those psychoanalysts in French feminism specifically, and a couple of other ideas. So that's the best I can do. That's a big question. Yeah. Any other questions before we go to what is waiting for us? I don't know what's waiting for us. Yeah.
Thank you, David. I will say I agree with everything you said in your presentation. Not so sure about the Q&A.
Oh, good, good.
No, seriously, my question is about the nature of both revelation and of theology proper. So the Second Council, David Irwin 11 talks about God reveals these truths for the sake of our salvation.
Mm-hmm.
Right? There seems to be some practical end
Yep.
in mind there.
Yeah, yeah.
Aquinas will talk about this as a supernatural end, and he says that Sacra Doctrina itself is both theoretical or speculative and practical.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, it's the supreme practical science.
Right.
So how do we reconcile these ideas with your account of the university and its abhorrence, maybe, of the practical?
But I think maybe the question is going to turn around what do we mean by practical, and then the relationship between the practical and the speculative. See if I can summarize this as quickly as possible. Though salvation might sound like a practical end, I would suggest it's actually speculative. It is the beatific vision. It is the eternal knowledge of God. Union and contemplation with God is what is the end, you might say, of salvation. That is what we are being saved for or towards. And so if that's the case, then though salvation could be portrayed as a practical end, it is indeed a speculative end. And the practical would be made subservient to that. And we can even go to Aristotle for this point, where Aristotle will say that we distinguish between speculative and practical. You need to have both wisdoms, but the practical is necessary to allow you to do the speculative, if I could put it that way. In fact, maybe I could put it even, I think maybe I'll try to put this even clearer. For Aristotle, virtue is one. It is a single unity, kind of like the university. Though there may be many virtues, some of them being moral, some of them are speculative. You've got to have them all in order to be a virtuous person. You can't be without the moral virtues and be speculatively virtuous. And you also can't be speculatively virtuous without the moral virtues. They both come together in one. However, thinking about knowledge or wisdom in relationship to ends, the practical virtues are directed towards being able to act rightly. And so they are for something, whereas a speculative wisdom is an end in itself. Another way maybe of putting this is that the practical virtues are for the end, which is the speculative. It's subservient to that. I think that's the best I can do in 2 minutes or less. Does that answer your question sufficiently? Sounds good. All right. Where are we headed? All right.